Throughout the week, I spent much of my free time on that balcony looking down on Leinster Bay, trying to understand my feelings. I came to realize that although I had quit, I had not taken the next step, and that my decision to remain in the middle was exacting a devastating toll. By the end of the week, I had concluded that the world around me was not one that I wanted to dream, and that I needed to do exactly what I was instructing my students to do, to change my dreams in ways that reflected what I really wanted in my life. When I returned home, I gave up my corporate consulting practice. The president of SWEC who had hired me was now retired. A new man had come aboard, one who was younger than me, and was apparently unconcerned about me telling my story. He had initiated a cost-cutting program, and was happy not to have to pay me that exorbitant retainer any longer. I decided to complete the book I had been working on for so long, and just making the decision brought a wonderful sense of relief. I shared my ideas about writing with close friends, mostly people in the nonprofit world who were involved with indigenous cultures and rainforest preservation. To my surprise, they were dismayed. They feared that speaking out would undermine my teaching work and jeopardize the nonprofit organizations I supported. Many of us were helping Amazon tribes protect their lands from oil companies. Coming clean, I was told, could undermine my credibility and might set back the whole movement. Some even threatened to withdraw their support. So, once again, I stopped writing. Instead, I focused on taking people deep into the Amazon, showing them a place and a tribe that are mostly untouched by the modern world. In fact, that is where I was on September 11th, 2001. Chapter 32. September 11th and its aftermath, for me, personally. On September 10th, 2001, I was traveling down a river in the Ecuadorian Amazon with Shakaim Chumpi, the co-author of my book, Spirit of the Shuar. We were leading a group of 16 North Americans to his community deep in the rainforest. The visitors had come to learn about his people and to help them preserve their precious rainforests. Shakaim had fought as a soldier in the recent Ecuador-Peru conflict. Most people in the major oil-consuming nations have never heard about this war, yet it was fought primarily to provide them with oil. Although the border between these two countries was disputed for many years, only recently did a resolution become urgent. The reason for the urgency was that the oil companies needed to know with which country to negotiate in order to win concessions for specific tracts of the oil-rich lands. Borders had to be defined. The Shuars formed Ecuador's first line of defense. They proved themselves to be ferocious fighters, often overcoming superior numbers and better-equipped forces. The Shuars did not know anything about the politics behind the war, or that its resolution would open the door to oil companies. They fought because they come from a long tradition of warriors, and because they were not about to allow foreign soldiers onto their lands. As we paddled down the river, watching a flock of chattering parrots fly overhead, I asked Shakaim whether the truce was still holding. "Yes," he said, "but I'm afraid I must tell you that we are now preparing to go to war with you." He went on to explain that, of course, he did not mean me personally, or the people in our group. "You are our friends," he assured me. He was, he said, referring to our oil companies and to the military forces that would come into his jungle to defend them. "We've seen what they did to the Warona tribe. They destroyed their forests, polluted the rivers, and killed many people, including children. Today, the Warona hardly exist as a people anymore. We won't let that happen to us. We won't allow oil companies into our territory, any more than we would the Peruvians. We have all sworn to fight to the last man." That night, our group sat around a fire in the center of a beautiful Shuar longhouse, built from split bamboo slats placed in the ground and covered with a thatched roof. I told them about my conversation with Shakaim. We all wondered how many other people in the world felt similarly about our oil companies and our country. How many, like the Shuars, were terrified that we would come into their lives and destroy their culture and their lands. How many hated us. The next morning, I went down to the little office where we kept our two-way radio. I needed to arrange for pilots to fly in and pick us up in a few days. As I was talking with them, I heard a shout. "My God!" the man on the other end of the radio exclaimed. "New York is under attack." He turned up the commercial radio that had been playing music in the background. During the next half hour, we received a minute-by-minute account of the events unfolding in the United States. Like everyone else, it was a moment I shall never forget. When I returned to my home in Florida, I knew I had to visit Ground Zero, the former site of the World Trade Center towers, so I arranged to fly to New York. I checked into my uptown hotel in early afternoon. It was a sunny November day, unseasonably balmy. I strolled along Central Park, filled with enthusiasm. Then headed for a part of the city where once I had spent a lot of time, the area near Wall Street, now known as Ground Zero. As I approached, my enthusiasm was replaced with a sense of horror. The sights and smells were overwhelming, the incredible destruction, the twisted and melted skeletons of those once great buildings, the debris, the rancid odor of smoke, charred ruins, and burnt flesh. I had seen it all on TV, but being here was different. I had not been prepared for this, especially not for the people. 2 months had passed, and still they stood around, those who lived or worked nearby, those who had survived. An Egyptian man was loitering outside his small shoe repair shop, shaking his head in disbelief. "Can't get used to it," he muttered. "I lost many customers, many friends. My nephew died up there." He pointed at the blue sky. "I think I saw him jump. I don't know. So many were jumping, holding hands and flapping their arms as though they could fly." It came as a surprise, the way people talked with one another, in New York City, and it went beyond language. Their eyes met. Although somber, they exchanged looks of compassion, half-smiles, that spoke more than a million words. But there was something else, a sense about the place itself. At first I couldn't figure it out. Then it struck me. The light. Lower Manhattan had been a dark canyon back in the days when I made the pilgrimage to this part of town to raise capital for IPS, when I used to plot strategy with my investment bankers over dinner at Windows on the World. You had to go that high, to the top of the World Trade Center, if you wanted to see light. Now, here it was at street level. The canyon had been split wide open, and we who stood on the street beside the ruins were warmed by the sunshine. I couldn't help wondering if the view of the sky, of the light, had helped people open their hearts. I felt guilty just thinking such thoughts. I turned the corner at Trinity Church and headed down Wall Street. Back to the old New York, enveloped in shadow. No sky, no light. People hurried along the sidewalk, ignoring one another. A cop screamed at a stalled car. I sat down on the first steps I came to, at number 14. From somewhere, the sounds of giant fans or an air blower rose above the other noises. It seemed to come from the massive stone wall of the New York Stock Exchange building. I watched the people. They hustled up and down the street, leaving their offices, hurrying home, or heading to a restaurant or bar to discuss business. A few walked in tandem and chatted with each other. Most, though, were alone and silent. I tried to make eye contact. It didn't happen. The wail of a car alarm drew my attention down the street. A man rushed out of an office and pointed a key at the car. The alarm went silent. I sat there quietly for a few long moments. After a while, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, covered with statistics. Then I saw him. He shuffled along the street, staring down at his feet. He had a scrawny gray beard and wore a grimy overcoat that looked especially out of place on this warm afternoon on Wall Street. I knew he was Afghan. He glanced at me. Then, after only a second of hesitation, he started up the steps. He nodded politely and sat down beside me, leaving a yard or two between us. From the way he looked straight ahead, I realized it would be up to me to begin the conversation. "Nice afternoon."
"Beautiful."
His accent was thick.
"Times like these, we want sunshine."
"You mean because of the World Trade Center?" He nodded. "You're from Afghanistan?" He stared at me.
"Is it so obvious?"
"I've traveled a lot. Recently I visited the Himalayas, Kashmir."
"Kashmir?"
He pulled at his beard.
"Fighting?"
"Yes, India and Pakistan. Hindus and Muslims. Makes you wonder about religion, doesn't it?" His eyes met mine. They were deep brown, nearly black. They struck me as wise and sad. He turned back toward the New York Stock Exchange building. With a long, gnarled finger, he pointed at the building. "Or maybe," I agreed, "it's about economics, not religion."
"You were a soldier?"
I couldn't help but chuckle. "No, an economic consultant." I handed him the paper with the statistics. These were my weapons. He reached over and took them.
"Numbers?"
"World statistics." He studied the list, then gave a little laugh.
"I can't read."
He handed it back to me. "The numbers tell us that 24,000 people die every day from hunger." He whistled softly, then took a moment to think about this, and sighed.
"I was almost one of them.
I had a little pomegranate farm near Kandahar. Russians arrived, and Mujahideen hid behind trees and in water ditches." He raised his hands and pointed them like a rifle.
"Ambushing."
He lowered his hands.
"All my trees and ditches were destroyed."
"After that, what did you do?" He nodded at the list I held.
"Does it show beggars?"
It did not, but I thought I remembered. About 80 million in the world, I believe.
"I was one."
He shook his head, seemed lost in thought. We sat in silence for a few minutes before he spoke again.
"I do not like beggaring. My child dies, so I raise poppies."
"Opium?" He shrugged.
"No trees, no water. The only way to feed our families."
I felt a lump in my throat, a depressing sense of sadness combined with guilt. We call raising opium poppies evil, yet many of our wealthiest people owe their fortunes to the drug trade. His eyes met mine and seemed to penetrate my soul.
"You were a soldier,"
he stated, nodding his head to confirm this simple fact. Then he rose slowly to his feet and hobbled down the steps. I wanted him to stay, but I felt powerless to say anything. I managed to get to my feet and start after him. At the bottom of the steps, I was stopped by a sign. It included a picture of the building where I had been seated. At the top, it notified passers-by that the sign had been erected by Heritage Trails of New York. It said, "The Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, piled on top of the bell tower of St. Mark's in Venice, at the corner of Wall and Broad. That's the design concept behind 14 Wall Street." In its day, the world's tallest bank building, the 539-foot-high skyscraper originally housed the headquarters of Bankers Trust, one of the country's wealthiest financial institutions. I stood there in awe and looked up at this building. Shortly after the turn of the last century, 14 Wall Street had played the role the World Trade Center would later assume. It had been the very symbol of power and economic domination. It had also housed Bankers Trust, one of the firms I had employed to finance my energy company. It was an essential part of my heritage. The heritage, as the old Afghan man so aptly put it, of a soldier. That I had ended up here this day, talking with him, seemed an odd coincidence. Coincidence. The word stopped me. I thought about how our reactions to coincidences mold our lives. How should I react to this one? Continuing to walk, I scanned the heads in the crowd, but I could find no sign of him. At the next building, there was an immense statue, shrouded in blue plastic. An engraving on the building's stone face revealed that this was Federal Hall, 26 Wall Street, where, on April 30th, 1789, George Washington had taken the oath of office as first President of the United States. This was the exact spot where the first man, given the responsibility to safeguard life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people, was sworn in. So close to Ground Zero. So close to Wall Street. I went on around the block to Pine Street. There I came face to face with the world headquarters of Chase, the bank David Rockefeller built, a bank seeded with oil money and harvested by men like me. This bank, an institution that served the EHMs and that was a master at promoting global empire, was in many ways the very symbol of the corporatocracy. I recalled reading that the World Trade Center was a project started by David Rockefeller in 1960, and that in recent years the complex had been considered an albatross. It had the reputation of being a financial misfit, unsuited to modern fiber optic and internet technologies, and burdened with an inefficient and costly elevator system. Those two towers had once been nicknamed David and Nelson. Now the albatross was gone. I kept walking slowly, almost reluctantly. Despite the warmth of the afternoon, I felt a chill, and I realized that a strange anxiousness, a foreboding, had taken hold of me. I could not identify its source, and I tried to brush it off, picking up my pace. I eventually found myself once again looking at that smoldering hole, the twisted metal, that great scar in the earth. I leaned against a building that had escaped the destruction and stared into the pit. I tried to imagine the people rushing out of the collapsing tower and the firefighters dashing in to help them. I tried to think about the people who had jumped, the desperation they felt. But none of these things came to me. Instead, I saw Osama bin Laden accepting money and weapons worth millions of dollars from a man employed by a consulting company under contract to the United States government. Then I saw myself sitting at a computer with a blank screen. I looked around, away from Ground Zero, at the New York streets that had avoided the fire and now were returning to normal. I wondered what the people who walked those streets today thought about all this, not simply about the destruction of the towers, but also about the ruined pomegranate farms and the 24,000 who starve every single day. I wondered if they thought about such things at all, if they could tear themselves away from their jobs and gas-guzzling cars and their interest payments long enough to consider their own contribution to the world they were passing on to their children. I wondered what they knew about Afghanistan, not the Afghanistan on television, the one littered with U.S. military tents and tanks, but the old man's Afghanistan. I wondered what those 24,000 who die every day think. And then I saw myself again, sitting before a blank computer screen. I forced my attention back to Ground Zero. At the moment, one thing was certain. My country was thinking about revenge, and it was focusing on countries like Afghanistan. But I was thinking about all the other places in the world where people hate our companies, our military, our policies, and our march toward global empire. I wondered, what about Panama, Ecuador, Indonesia, Iran, Guatemala, most of Africa? I pushed myself off the wall I had been leaning against and started walking away. A short, swarthy man was waving a newspaper in the air and shouting in Spanish. I stopped. "Venezuela on the brink of revolution," he yelled above the noise of the traffic, the honking horns, and the milling people. I bought his paper and stood there for a moment scanning the lead article. It was about Hugo Chavez, Venezuela's democratically elected, anti-American president, and the undercurrent of hatred generated by U.S. policies in Latin America. What about Venezuela? Chapter 33. Venezuela, saved by Saddam. I had watched Venezuela for many years. It was a classic example of a country that rose from rags to riches as a result of oil. It was also a model of the turmoil oil wealth foments, of the disequilibrium between rich and poor, and of a country shamelessly exploited by the corporatocracy. It had become the epitome of a place where old-style EHMs like me converged with the new-style corporate version. The events I read about in the newspaper that day at Ground Zero were a direct result of the 1998 elections, when the poor and disenfranchised of Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez by a landslide as their president. He immediately instituted drastic measures, taking control of the courts and other institutions and dissolving the Venezuelan Congress. He denounced the United States for its shameless imperialism, spoke out forcefully against globalization, and introduced a hydrocarbons law that was reminiscent, even in name, to the one Jaime Roldos had brought to Ecuador shortly before his helicopter went down. The law doubled the royalties charged to foreign oil companies. Then Chavez defied the traditional independence of the state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, by replacing its top executives with people loyal to him. Venezuelan oil is crucial to economies around the world. In 2002, the nation was the world's fourth largest oil exporter and the number 3 supplier to the United States. Petróleos de Venezuela, with 40,000 employees and $50 billion a year in sales, provides 80% of the country's export revenue. It is by far the most important factor in Venezuela's economy. By taking over the industry, Chavez had thrust himself onto the world stage as a major player. Many Venezuelans saw this as destiny, the completion of a process that began 80 years earlier. On December 14, 1922, a huge oil blowout had gushed from the earth near Maracaibo. 100,000 barrels of crude sprayed into the air each day for the next 3 days. And this single geologic event changed Venezuela forever. By 1930, the country was the world's largest oil exporter. Venezuelans looked to oil as a solution to all their problems. Oil revenues during the next 40 years enabled Venezuela to evolve from one of the most impoverished nations in the world to one of the wealthiest in Latin America. All of the country's vital statistics improved: healthcare, education, employment, longevity, and infant survival rates. Businesses prospered. During the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, petroleum prices skyrocketed and Venezuela's national budget quadrupled. The EHMs went to work. The international banks flooded the country with loans that paid for vast infrastructure and industrial projects, and for the highest skyscrapers on the continent. Then, in the 1980s, the corporate-style EHMs arrived. It was an ideal opportunity for them to cut their fledgling teeth. The Venezuelan middle class had become sizable and provided a ripe market for a vast array of products. Yet there was still a very large poor sector available to labor in the sweatshops and factories. Then oil prices crashed, and Venezuela could not repay its debts. In 1989, the IMF imposed harsh austerity measures and pressured Caracas to support the corporatocracy in many other ways. Venezuelans reacted violently. Riots killed over 200 people. The illusion of oil as a bottomless source of support was shattered. Between 1978 and 2003, Venezuela's per capita income plummeted by over 40%. As poverty increased, resentment intensified. Polarization resulted, with the middle class pitted against the poor. As so often occurs in countries whose economies depend on oil production, demographics radically shifted. The sinking economy took its toll on the middle class, and many fell into the ranks of the poor. The new demographics set the stage for Chavez, and for conflict with Washington. Once in power, the new president took actions that challenged the Bush administration. Just before the September 11th attacks, Washington was considering its options. The EHMs had failed. Was it time to send in the jackals? Then 9/11 changed all priorities. President Bush and his advisors focused on rallying the world community to support U.S. activities in Afghanistan and an invasion of Iraq. On top of that, the U.S. economy was in the middle of a recession. Venezuela was relegated to a back burner. However, it was obvious that at some point, Bush and Chavez would come to blows. With Iraqi and other Middle Eastern oil supplies threatened, Washington could not afford to ignore Venezuela for long. Wandering around Ground Zero and Wall Street, meeting the old Afghan man, and reading about Chavez's Venezuela, brought me to a point I had avoided for many years, and it forced me to take a hard look at the consequences of the things I had done over the past 3 decades. I could not possibly deny the role I had played, or the fact that my work as an EHM now affected my daughter's generation in very negative ways. I knew I could no longer postpone taking action to atone for what I had done. I had to come clean about my life, in a manner that would help people wake up to the fact of corporatocracy and understand why so much of the world hates us. I started writing once again, but as I did so, it seemed to me that my story was too old. Somehow, I needed to bring it up to date. I considered traveling to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Venezuela, and writing a contemporary commentary on those 3 countries. They seemed to embody an irony of current world affairs. Each had undergone traumatic political turmoil, and ended up with leaders who left a great deal to be desired. A cruel and despotic Taliban, a psychopathic Saddam, and an economically inept Chavez. Yet, in no case did the corporatocracy respond by attempting to solve the deeper problems of these countries. Rather, the response was simply to undermine leaders who stood in the way of our oil policies. In many respects, Venezuela was the most intriguing case because, while military intervention had already occurred in Afghanistan and appeared inevitable in Iraq, the administration's response to Chavez remained a mystery. As far as I was concerned, the issue was not about whether Chavez was a good leader. It was about Washington's reaction to a leader who stood in the way of the corporatocracy's march to global empire. Before I had time to organize such a trip, however, circumstances once again intervened. My nonprofit work took me to South America several times in 2002. A Venezuelan family whose businesses were going bankrupt under the Chavez regime joined one of my trips to the Amazon. We became close friends, and I heard their side of the story. I also met with Latin Americans from the other end of the economic spectrum, who considered Chavez a savior. The events unfolding in Caracas were symptomatic of the world we EHMs had created. By December 2002, the situation in both Venezuela and in Iraq reached crisis points. The 2 countries were evolving into perfect counterpoints for each other. In Iraq, all the subtle efforts, both the EHMs and the jackals, had failed to force Saddam to comply, and now we were preparing for the ultimate solution, invasion. In Venezuela, the Bush administration was bringing Kermit Roosevelt's Iranian model into play. As the New York Times reported, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans filled the streets here today to declare their commitment to a national strike, now in its 28th day, to force the ouster of President Hugo Chavez. The strike, joined by an estimated 30,000 oil workers, threatens to wreak havoc on this nation, the world's 5th largest oil producer, for months to come. In recent days, the strike has reached a kind of stalemate. Mr. Chavez is using non-striking workers to try to normalize operations at the state-owned oil company. His opponents, led by a coalition of business and labor leaders, contend, though, that their strike will push the company, and thus the Chavez government, to collapse. This was exactly how the CIA brought down Mossadegh and replaced him with the Shah. The analogy could not have been stronger. It seemed history was uncannily repeating itself 50 years later. 5 decades, and still oil was the driving force. On January 4, 2003, Chavez's supporters clashed with his opponents. 2 people were shot to death, and dozens more were wounded. The next day, I talked with an old friend who for many years had been involved with the Jackals. Like me, he had never worked directly for any government, but he had led clandestine operations in many countries. He told me that a private contractor had approached him to foment strikes in Caracas and to bribe military officers, many of whom had been trained at the School of the Americas, to turn against their elected president. He had turned down the offer, but he confided, "The man who took the job knows what he's doing." That same month, January 2003, saw crude oil prices rise to high levels and American inventories close to a 26-year low. Given the Middle East situation, I knew the Bush administration was doing everything in its power to overthrow Chavez. Then came the news that they had succeeded. Chavez had been ousted. The New York Times took this turn of events as an opportunity to provide a historical perspective, and also to identify the man who appeared to play the Kermit Roosevelt role in contemporary Venezuela. The United States supported authoritarian regimes throughout Central and South America during and after the Cold War in defense of its economic and political interests. In tiny Guatemala, the Central Intelligence Agency mounted a coup overthrowing the democratically elected government in 1954, and it backed subsequent right-wing governments against small leftist rebel groups for 4 decades. Roughly 200,000 civilians died. In Chile, a CIA-supported coup helped put General Augusto Pinochet in power from 1973 to 1990. In Peru, a fragile democratic government is still unraveling the agency's role in a decade of support for the now deposed and disgraced president Alberto K. Fujimori and his disreputable spy chief Vladimiro L. Montesinos. The United States had to invade Panama in 1989 to topple its narco-dictator Manuel A. Noriega, who, for almost 20 years, was a valued informant for American intelligence. And the struggle to mount an unarmed opposition against Nicaragua's leftists in the 1980s by any means necessary, including selling arms to Iran for cold cash, led to indictments against senior Reagan administration officials. Among those investigated back then was Otto J. Reich, a veteran of Latin American struggles. No charges were ever filed against Mr. Reich. He later became United States Ambassador to Venezuela, and now serves as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs by presidential appointment. The fall of Mr. Chavez is a feather in his cap. If Mr. Reich and the Bush administration were celebrating the coup against Chavez, the party was suddenly cut short. In an amazing turnabout, Chavez regained the upper hand and was back in power less than 72 hours later. Unlike Mossadegh in Iran, Chavez had managed to keep the military on his side, despite all attempts to turn its highest-ranking officers against him. In addition, he had the powerful state oil company on his side. Petróleos de Venezuela defied the thousands of striking workers and made a comeback. Once the dust cleared, Chavez tightened his government's grip on oil company employees, purged the military of the few disloyal officers who had been persuaded to betray him, and forced many of his key opponents out of the country. He demanded 20-year prison terms for 2 prominent opposition leaders, Washington-connected operatives who had joined the Jackals to direct the nationwide strike. In the final analysis, the entire sequence of events was a calamity for the Bush administration. As the Los Angeles Times reported, Bush administration officials acknowledged Tuesday that they had discussed the removal of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez for months with military and civilian leaders from Venezuela. The administration's handling of the abortive coup has come under increasing scrutiny. It was obvious that not only had the EHMs failed, but so had the jackals. Venezuela in 2003 turned out to be very different from Iran in 1953. I wondered if this was a harbinger or simply an anomaly, and what Washington would do next. At least for the time being, I believe a serious crisis was averted in Venezuela, and Chavez was saved by Saddam Hussein. The Bush administration could not take on Afghanistan, Iraq, and Venezuela all at once. At the moment, it had neither the military muscle nor the political support to do so. I knew, however, that such circumstances could change quickly, and that President Chavez was likely to face fierce opposition in the near future. Nonetheless, Venezuela was a reminder that not much had changed in 50 years, except the outcome. Chapter 34. Ecuador Revisited. Venezuela was a classic case. However, as I watched events unfolding there, I was struck by the fact that the truly significant battle lines were being drawn in yet another country. They were significant not because they represented more in terms of dollars or human lives, but because they involved issues that went far beyond the materialistic goals that generally define empires. These battle lines extended beyond the armies of bankers, business executives, and politicians, deep into the soul of modern civilization. And they were being established in a country I had come to know and love, the one where I had first worked as a Peace Corps volunteer, Ecuador. In the years since I first went there, in 1968, this tiny country had evolved into the quintessential victim of the corporatocracy. My contemporaries and I, and our modern corporate equivalents, had managed to bring it to virtual bankruptcy. We loaned it billions of dollars so it could hire our engineering and construction firms to build projects that would help its richest families. As a result, in those 3 decades, the official poverty level grew from 50 to 70%. Under- or unemployment increased from 15 to 70%. Public debt increased from $240 million to $16 billion, and the share of national resources allocated to the poorest citizens declined from 20% to 6%. Today, Ecuador must devote nearly 50% of its national budget simply to paying off its debts, instead of to helping the millions of its citizens who are officially classified as dangerously impoverished. The situation in Ecuador clearly demonstrates that this was not the result of a conspiracy. It was a process that had occurred during both Democratic and Republican administrations, a process that had involved all the major multinational banks, many corporations, and foreign aid missions from a multitude of countries. The United States played the lead role, but we had not acted alone. During those 3 decades, thousands of men and women participated in bringing Ecuador to the tenuous position it found itself in at the beginning of the millennium. Some of them, like me, had been aware of what they were doing, but the vast majority had merely performed the tasks they had been taught in business, engineering, and law schools, or had followed the lead of bosses in my mold, who demonstrated the system by their own greedy example, and through rewards and punishments calculated to perpetuate it. Such participants saw the parts they played as benign at worst. In the most optimistic view, they were helping an impoverished nation. Although unconscious, deceived, and in many cases self-deluded, these players were not members of any clandestine conspiracy. Rather, they were the product of a system that promotes the most subtle and effective form of imperialism the world has ever witnessed. No one had to go out and seek men and women who could be bribed or threatened. They had already been recruited by companies, banks, and government agencies. The bribes consisted of salaries, bonuses, pensions, and insurance policies. The threats were based on social mores, peer pressure, and unspoken questions about the future of their children's education. The system had succeeded spectacularly. By the time the new millennium rolled in, Ecuador was thoroughly entrapped. We had her, just as a mafia don has the man whose daughter's wedding and small business he has financed and then refinanced. Like any good mafiosi, we had taken our time. We could afford to be patient, knowing that beneath Ecuador's rainforests lies a sea of oil, knowing that the proper day would come. That day had already arrived when, in early 2003, I wound my way from Quito to the jungle town of Shell in my Subaru Outback. Chavez had re-established himself in Venezuela. He had defied George W. Bush and had won. Saddam was standing his ground and was preparing to be invaded. Oil supplies were depleted to their lowest level in nearly 3 decades, and the prospects of taking more from our prime sources looked bleak, and therefore so did the health of the corporatocracy's balance sheets. We needed an ace in the hole. It was time to cut away our Ecuadorian pound of flesh. As I drove past the monster dam on the Pastaza River, I realized that here in Ecuador the battle was not simply the classic struggle between the rich of the world and the impoverished, between those who exploit and the exploited. These battle lines would ultimately define who we are as a civilization. We were poised to force this tiny country to open its Amazon rainforests to our oil companies. The devastation that would result was immeasurable. If we insisted on collecting the debt, the repercussions would go far beyond our abilities to quantify them. It was not just about the destruction of indigenous cultures, human lives, and hundreds of thousands of species of animals, reptiles, fish, insects, and plants, some of which might contain the undiscovered cures to any number of diseases. It was not just that rainforests absorb the deadly greenhouse gases produced by our industries, give off the oxygen that is essential to our lives, and seed the clouds that ultimately create a large percentage of the world's fresh water. It went beyond all the standard arguments made by ecologists for saving such places, and reached deep into our souls. If we pursued this strategy, we would continue an imperialist pattern that had begun long before the Roman Empire. We decry slavery, but our global empire enslaves more people than the Romans and all the other colonial powers before us. I wondered how we could execute such a short-sighted policy in Ecuador and still live with our collective conscience. Peering through the window of the Subaru at the deforested slopes of the Andes, an area that during my Peace Corps days had been lush with tropical growth, I was suddenly surprised by another realization. It dawned on me that this view of Ecuador as a significant battle line was purely personal, that in fact every country where I had worked, every country with resources coveted by the empire, was equally significant. I had my attachment to this one, which stemmed from those days back in the late 1960s when I lost my innocence here. However, it was subjective, my personal bias. Though the Ecuadorian rainforests are precious, as are the indigenous people and all the other life forms that inhabit them, they are no more precious than the deserts of Iran and the Bedouins of Yemen's heritage, no more precious than the mountains of Java, the seas off the coast of the Philippines, the steppes of Asia, the savannas of Africa, the forests of North America, the ice caps of the Arctic, or hundreds of other threatened places. Every one of these represents a battle line, and every one of them forces us to search the depths of our individual and collective souls. I was reminded of a statistic that sums it all up. The income ratio of the 1/5 of the world's population in the wealthiest countries to the 1/5 in the poorest countries went from 30-1 in 1960 to 74-1 in 1995. And the World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the IMF, and the rest of the banks, corporations, and governments involved in international aid continue to tell us that they are doing their jobs, that progress has been made. So, here I was in Ecuador again, in the country that was just one of many battle lines, but that holds a special place in my heart. It was 2003, 35 years after I had first arrived as a member of a U.S. organization that bears the word peace in its name. This time, I had come in order to try to prevent a war that for 3 decades I had helped to provoke. It would seem that events in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Venezuela might be enough to deter us from another conflict. Yet, in Ecuador, the situation was very different. This war would not require the U.S. Army, for it would be fought by a few thousand indigenous warriors, equipped only with spears, machetes, and single-shot, muzzle-loaded rifles. They would face off against a modern Ecuadorian army, a handful of U.S. Special Forces advisors, and jackal-trained mercenaries hired by the oil companies. This would be a war, like the 1995 conflict between Ecuador and Peru, that most people in the United States would never hear about. And recent events had escalated the probability of such a war. In December 2002, oil company representatives accused an indigenous community of taking a team of its workers hostage. They suggested that the warriors involved were members of a terrorist group, with implications of possible ties to Al-Qaeda. It was an issue made especially complicated because the oil company had not received government permission to begin drilling. However, the company claimed its workers had the right to perform preliminary, non-drilling investigations, a claim vehemently disputed by the indigenous groups a few days later when they shared their side of the story. The oil workers, tribal representatives insisted, had trespassed on lands where they were not allowed. The warriors had carried no weapons, nor had they threatened the oil workers with violence of any sort. In fact, they had escorted the workers to their village, where they offered them food and chicha, a local beer. While their visitors feasted, the warriors persuaded the workers' guides to paddle away. However, the tribe claimed the workers were never held against their will. They were free to go wherever they pleased. Driving down that road, I remembered what the Shuars had told me in 1990 when, after selling IPS, I returned to offer to help them save their forests. "The world is as you dream it," they had said, and then pointed out that we in the North had dreamed of huge industries, lots of cars, and gigantic skyscrapers. Now we had discovered that our vision had in fact been a nightmare that would ultimately destroy us all. Change that dream, the Shuars had advised me. Yet here it was more than a decade later, and despite the work of many people and non-profit organizations, including the ones I had worked with, the nightmare had reached new and horrifying proportions. When my Outback finally pulled into the jungle town of Shell, I was hustled off to a meeting. The men and women who attended represented many tribes: Quechua, Shuar, Achuar, Shiwiar, and Zaparo. Some had walked for days through the jungle. Others had flown in on small planes, funded by non-profits. A few wore their traditional kilts, face paint, and feathered headbands, though most attempted to emulate the townspeople, wearing slacks, T-shirts, and shoes. Representatives from the community accused of taking hostages spoke first. They told us that shortly after the workers returned to the oil company, over 100 Ecuadorian soldiers arrived in their small community. They reminded us that this was at the beginning of a special season in the rainforests, the fruiting of the chonta, a tree sacred to indigenous cultures. Its fruit comes but once a year and signals the start of the mating season for many of the region's birds, including rare and endangered species. As they flock to it, the birds are extremely vulnerable. The tribes enforce strict policies forbidding the hunting of these birds during chonta season. "The timing of the soldiers couldn't have been worse," a woman explained. I felt her pain, and that of her companions, as they told their tragic stories about how the soldiers ignored the prohibitions. They shot down the birds for sport and for food. In addition, they raided family gardens, banana groves, and manioc fields, often irreparably destroying the sparse topsoil. They used explosives in the rivers for fishing, and they ate family pets. They confiscated the local hunters' guns and blowguns, dug improper latrines, polluted the rivers with fuel oil and solvents, sexually molested women, and neglected to properly dispose of garbage, which attracted insects and vermin. "We had two choices," a man said. "We could fight, or we could swallow our pride and do our best to repair the damage. We decided it was not yet the time to fight." He described how they had attempted to compensate for the military's abuses by encouraging their own people to go without food. He called it a fast, but in fact it sounded closer to voluntary starvation. Old people and children became malnourished and grew sick. They spoke about threats and bribes. "My son," a woman said, "speaks English as well as Spanish and several indigenous dialects. He worked as a guide and translator for an ecotourist company. They paid him a decent salary. The oil company offered him 10 times as much. What could he do? Now he writes letters denouncing his old company and all the others who come to help us, and in his letters calls the oil companies our friends." She shook her body like a dog shaking off water. "He is no longer one of us, my son." An elderly man, wearing the traditional toucan feather headdress of a shaman, stood up. "You know about those 3 we elected to represent us against the oil companies, who died in that plane crash? Well, I'm not going to stand here and tell you what so many say, that the oil companies caused the crash. But I can tell you that those 3 deaths dug a big hole in our organization. The oil companies lost no time filling that hole with their people." Another man produced a contract and read it. In exchange for $300,000, it ceded a vast territory over to a lumber company. It was signed by 3 tribal officials. "These aren't their real signatures," he said. "I ought to know. One is my brother. It's another type of assassination, to discredit our leaders." It seemed ironic and strangely appropriate that this was taking place in a region of Ecuador where the oil companies had not yet been given permission to drill. They had drilled in many areas around this one, and the indigenous people had seen the results, had witnessed the destruction of their neighbors. As I sat there listening, I asked myself how the citizens of my country would react if gatherings like this were featured on CNN or the evening news. The meetings were fascinating, and the revelations deeply disturbing. But something else also happened, outside the formal setting of those sessions. During breaks, at lunch and in the evening, when I talked with people privately, I frequently was asked why the United States was threatening Iraq. The impending war was discussed on the front pages of Ecuadorian newspapers that made their way into this jungle town, and the coverage was very different from coverage in the States. It included references to the Bush family's ownership of oil companies and United Fruit, and to Vice President Cheney's role as former CEO of Halliburton. These newspapers were read to men and women who had never attended school. Everyone seemed to take an interest in this issue. Here I was, in the Amazon rainforest, among illiterate people many in North America consider backward, even savages. And yet, probing questions were being asked that struck at the heart of the global empire.